Yeah, awesome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here, and really appreciate hearing all the perspectives it is that you've already shared. Um, for us at New Public, we really are thinking about what the answer to that first question is, and even this last one it is that Paul raised, which is what can we be learning from these physical spaces that are really helping us build what I think Annie referenced as these idiosyncratic relationships, these relationships that may not otherwise exist. And then what do the design patterns need to look like of the digital spaces it is that we create so that we're still achieving some of those goals? And so while we are beginning to really experiment with building these products, we are also continue to be inspired by learning and pursuing our curiosity about what it is that we can learn from kind of offline spaces as well. And so we are really, really excited to have partnered with Reboot, a sister organization that we have a lot of respect for, as we host the second event it is that we're having on our Trust magazine. And the magazine really serves as a place for us to kind of allow our imagination and creativity to unfold in different ways, to influence the products it is that we want to be building that represent what we call healthy digital public spaces. And yeah, we're really excited to have this as like a live way in community to be discussing some of the issues it is that were raised in the magazine in partnership with Annie, who wrote one of the pieces. And I think her provocation is one it is that's really stayed with me. So how might we redesign? I think Kenny already put this one in the chat, but this question around how might we design digital public spaces that allow us to experience life with more beauty, vulnerability, and pleasure. And so really excited to be in conversation with her and Matt to explore these questions and their experiences. So again, thank you everybody for being here. Our community is really important to us, and we feel really excited to be able to engage you in this conversation and learn alongside you. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Wilford, our editor-in-chief, the man who's really responsible for the coming together of this second magazine that we're celebrating, to kind of kick the panel off.
Thanks so much, Deepti. Thank you, everyone, for being here today and for already sharing such interesting thoughts and questions. Just a very quick introduction to what we did here. The second issue of our magazine is framed around the question of trust. There's a lot of ways to get into these big questions that we have in technology. And one thing that we like to do in New Public is to choose different human themes to try to approach these questions with each issue of our magazine. The last one was about decentralization. You might think about Web3 and blockchain when you hear that word, but we managed to do a whole issue about decentralization without, I think, once mentioning the word blockchain. So, the idea is we do things a little differently. We kind of look at the human questions underneath, these big themes. Trust, I think, is a variable that lies within a lot of these questions, right? How do we determine if someone online is who they claim to be? How do we make sure a digital space is actually safe? How do we make sure that some software or machine will actually do what it says it's going to do? But I think it's also a question about power, right? Because it implies a relationship between the truster and the trustee. When, for example, a platform asks you for your trust, you actually have a choice or just the illusion of one. If there is some kind of algorithm that determines a marginalized person is less trustworthy, does that person have any recourse? So provocations like these are kind of the starting point for this issue. It is available online right now. I think a lot of you already had a chance to give it a look. We're also releasing a free ebook, which will be sent to all of you soon after this event. With that, I'd love to, also tie this to the signals framework, which is that this is part of our efforts to connect, which is after we welcome people into the space and we understand each other, that we're actually cultivating these ties and trying to build these networks, right? Introducing our wonderful panelists today. We have Annie, who is a freelance journalist, and had the pleasure of working with her on this amazing piece. Jasmine Sun, who is the co-founder of Reboot, which has been a great partner to New Public. Matthew Sun, who's the digital director at Kernel Magazine, and then myself, I was the editor of the magazine. So we're going to be talking mostly about the articles that Annie wrote, as well as a piece that Matthew contributed to our newsletter a few months ago. And I think that this will be a really interesting conversation. So I'm going to get out of all your way, but before that, I wanted to just start out by giving you a chance to introduce yourselves, kind of how you identify, what perspective you represent, both here in this event and also in your writing. And if you could also tell us just a little bit, Annie and Matthew, about your pieces for those in the audience who may not have had a chance to fully read them yet. Annie, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wilfred. It's really lovely to be here this morning. Very excited for this discussion. My name is Annie Howard. I am a writer and housing organizer based in Chicago. My article is about basically a couple of different places that you might not think of when it comes to what we want to do with digital space, specifically Times Square porn theaters that no longer exist, as well as some lesbian spaces, broadly information activism, and kind of the lessons around creating community accountability, community norms, but also creating relationships and vulnerabilities that we don't often see online. There's a brief segue into Tumblr, which was not a part of my trans experience, but I talk about my friend Sasha, who had a good trans Tumblr experience, and talk about just how we need digital spaces that allow for more fluidity, more vulnerability, and most importantly, I think, being able to represent the fullness of ourselves and see the fullness of others. A lot of my work is centered around embodiment, and as a trans person, that's a pretty frequent thing that I'm thinking about. And so, yeah, when do we encounter each other in digital space? Often we're not encountering the full embodied versions of one another that we that we bring to our lives. And so I'm really grateful to be in this discussion. I don't know, Matthew or Jasmine, if you want to go next, but I'm really excited to be talking about your article, Matthew, and just to see where this goes today.
Yeah, awesome. I'm happy to go next. Hi, folks. I'm Matthew. I use he, him pronouns. I also identify as a gay man. Last year, I wrote a piece for Kernel Magazine, which was also republished through New Public, about segregation in digital environments and how that mediated my own process of growing up very online as a second-gen Chinese American. And the TLDR of that is I argue that segregation is produced online through a process that has many parallels to residential segregation. And I ask whether we might forge a way forward by thinking about online communities based on participation rather than based around consumption. I feel like there are a lot of interesting kind of like points of connection between Annie's piece and my own. So really excited to chat about that.
Cool. I can go next. So my name is Jasmine. I use she, her pronouns. I work on Reboot, which is a publication and community mostly for young technologists, broadly defined, investigating questions of tech, humanity, and power together. Also, as my day job, I work on product strategy and research at Substack, which is a digital media and publishing platform. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about cultivating digital communities, both sorts of jobs, and cultivating digital communities in both a social sense around norms and how people gather together, but also in terms of technical choices, design choices, and understanding how those help people feel more or less comfortable. I'm really excited to be here to learn from you all. Personally, I don't identify as queer, and so I think particularly understanding what understanding how queerness plays as a aspect of intersectionality into what makes spaces safe or unsafe is something that I'm really excited to learn about and talk about today.
Can I get started with a question for you, Matthew? Wonderful. Yeah, so we wanted to kind of have a little bit of back and forth about our two articles. And for those of you who have not read it yet, Matthew's piece is really lovely. I really hope you get a chance to see it. I thought it was really interesting that you started with the Thomas Schelling penny experiment. If you want to give people a quick rundown of that once I'm done chatting, please do. But I also really like, you bring in the history of like the John Perry Barlow Manifesto for Cyberspace. And I think you really do a good job. I mean, we all know how utopic and doomed it was. You call it doomed to fail. This idea that there would not be an end to prejudice based on difference, but there would just be an end to difference altogether. And I think you do a really good job of unpacking how harmful that is and how the segregation that you experienced in physical space then manifested in sort of segregation in digital spaces as well. I'm kind of mishmashing a bunch of different pieces of your article together. You talk about a lot of different really interesting things, but if you could talk a little bit more about how you kind of imagine slotting those things together and how your own experience of digital space and suburban space specifically kind of led you to write this piece.
Yeah, this is super timely. First of all, I moved back home to the suburbs with my parents a few months ago. So I'm thinking about this all the time and like community and how like digital community and the community I have or don't have in physical space that kind of like connects. Yeah, a quick summary of the Schelling experiment, which is kind of like the through line for my piece. So basically, Thomas Schelling was this economist who was interested in trying to use simulations to model how residential segregation might occur. And he uses this penny experiment where basically he has red and green pennies on, I guess, like a grid. And the effect of being a red penny is that if you are surrounded by other pennies that are of your same color, you choose not to move. But if the proportion of red pennies is below a certain threshold, say 30%, then the penny is moved to a new empty space on the grid. And you just do that sequentially, picking a new penny at random, seeing if there are enough neighbors of its own color. And if so, moving. And so basically, he shows that even if you start out with a very kind of distributed and like, I guess, well-mixed kind of board, even a mild in-group preference ends up after enough kind of steps of the simulation, producing very, very severe segregation. Now, there's a lot that this experiment doesn't take into account. It doesn't take into account history or power differentials or the different reasons why different groups might have a stronger in-group preference or I guess, an out-group dispreference. But even just pretending we live in a world where there's only these kind of like quote unquote neutral homophilic kind of preferences, you still end up getting very severe segregation. And the thesis that I'm trying to argue is that actually in the online world where the costs of, I guess, exiting a community and entering a new one or becoming affiliated with like a different website or something like that, the costs are actually so low compared to packing up everything and moving across the country, for example, that we should expect to see these processes of segregation actually accelerate online. So yeah, I hope that kind of summarizes the experiment well. I think like in my own life, I've been thinking a lot about how feeling a lack of community in the suburbs where I grew up really propelled me to try to find some semblance of community online. So I spent a lot of time indoors. I felt like there were a lot of activities there I did not feel, I either felt hypervisible or totally invisible. And so I felt like some of the only safe spaces I could access were these very digital heavy spaces. Yeah, I don't know, YouTube, various video games, etc. And I think as I've grown older, I've realized to a certain extent that those attachments were kind of like cruel optimism, I guess, to borrow Lauren Berlant's term, in that I became very dependent emotionally on having these communities, but I never really felt fulfilled because I didn't really feel like there was a way to participate in them actively. I was just kind of passively consuming content over and over again. So yeah, I've been thinking about, lately more than just how are these spaces an analog for each other, but actually how do they influence each other? How is there like an interaction between the two spaces? And that's something I'm curious about for you, Annie. In your piece, you kind of talk about the disappearance of these pornographic theaters, and yeah, what that might mean for digital spaces. But I'm curious, like, what do you see as being the interaction maybe between digital and physical spaces, especially when it comes to queerness?
Yeah, that's a very good question and not an easy one to answer. I am, really struck by my experience. I grew up in what is not a suburb, but what very much felt to me, Colorado Springs, Colorado. And, it was really a place where I did not feel like I could come out. I realized that pretty early on, or I guess I didn't even realize I was queer until I moved to the city. And then it was like, the city, the place where queers are. And so it's interesting where, we're translating so much of our lives to these digital spaces, but you still need a certain level of physical proximity in my mind to really be able to explore certain aspects of queerness that I don't think ever really has translated fully over into digital space. And it's really, I'm only 27. It's not like I have some like bygone experience of like living in a queer enclave and, then the internet came along, blah, blah, blah. But it's really still very interesting. There's an article that we talked about in planning this event that we can find and put in the chat, Gay in a TikTok Way, that was really frightening to me because it's just like all of these, people younger than me, early 20s, teens who are basically being outed by the algorithm. And oh, Lucas, you wrote that piece, amazing. It is amazing. It was such a good piece, and I can't even imagine, as painful and challenging and complicated as it was to figure out my own queerness, offline and online, it was mostly through community, and it was through physical community, right? It was through living in a co-op in a city with a lot of other queer people and being able to finally admit to myself that this was important and this is something I couldn't keep ignoring. Whereas now you see these situations where people are like, well, shit, the algorithm just keeps giving me this content. And why do I keep getting it? Why does it keep resonating? That's really fascinating. And I just don't know what that would feel like. It's just this like very generational thing where I'm very much a millennial, but not by much. And so then you see people just a couple years younger having a very different experience. How does that relate to like the physical digital like divide or like, continuity? I'm not exactly sure. Certainly, I hope that anyone who is feeling alienated by their experience of queerness in digital space can find their way to physical spaces with other queer people. That is typically a little, not always healthier, but at least a little, again, more embodied. And I think that being embodied with other queer people is really important. Having, just gone to some really good dance events over the weekend for Pride, you don't get some of that on digital spaces. And I guess that's what my piece is about, right? That like, these old Times Square porn theaters were a place where not only was there contact between queer people, but there was just interracial contact, cross-class contact, and really just a lot of space for people that were otherwise deeply marginalized to still assert a right to the city, to be in place, and to make those connections. And so I really appreciate it in your piece too, when to go away from the sort of alienation that you experienced in the suburbs and like the lack of community that you felt there. Near the end, you talk about the organizing that happened in San Francisco to refuse displacement from the hotel that a lot of Chinese immigrants were living in. I thought that's first of all, it's an amazing organizing history in general, and like such a good grounding experience of like, actually being together with people does make a huge difference. So why did that piece of history come into your mind as something to like kind of contrast with as you were, having these other comments about alienation and community?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I feel like, yeah, kind of around these themes of like participation, I feel like you're using the kind of language of like contact and like kind of contact across many different differences across many different axes. Yeah, I think I use the word participation as like a means to get maybe the same kind of idea where like if many people are participating in something together, because you build power in numbers, you often, yeah, have to create collectives where there is significant difference. I feel like a lot of the stuff that comes around, I don't know, my feed these days, it's like building community through like a set of like shared words or references or memes or something. Like I'm a huge Drag Race fan. During the pandemic, I became a bedroom queen. And yeah, I feel like there's so many like just like phrases and stuff like and references from like the 25 billion seasons of Drag Race that just like live in my head. And I'm like, these are like, this is nice and fun, but it's also like not, it's not something I'm actively out there doing with someone. It's like a shortcut to feeling like, oh, great. Like if you have the same set of like words or references, like maybe I feel a certain sense of like shared trust with you, but it's limited because it's not like we're actually out there doing things together. We're not in the world. We're not like creating our own shared experiences, if that makes sense. So I feel like the example with the iHotel was, it reminded me of when I was briefly involved in some housing organizing in undergrad, actually trying to get Stanford to build more housing on campus for service workers. That was such a cool experience. I remember really feeling like I was puncturing my bubble of other computer science students and meeting so many folks from like different disciplines, backgrounds, identities of all kinds through that organizing experience. And yeah, the iHotel example, even though I'm by no means like an expert in that history particularly, like I feel like it gestures at the same kind of idealistic democratic participation or something that I feel like is kind of key to creating these maybe cross-cutting experiences.
That's really wonderful. And sounds like we're both housing organizers then. So there you go. That's great. One thing I just wanted to mention just briefly, because I know we're going to go into the next section of things in just a moment. I have an article that will hopefully be coming out as we're doing this event. I was able to interview Gwendolyn Ann Smith, who is one of the founders of the first trans-specific digital space and also founded Trans Day of Remembrance. And, you know, the experience, like TDOR came out because of the digital space that she created that had a sort of separation for trans communities. So I'm just, as we kind of keep thinking about what does it mean to create a digital space that really meaningfully serves us, you know, it's like, it's not as if these things are impossible or have not already happened in some form. You know, I talk in the piece that the internet has become more homogenized, one could argue more gentrified, right? We've lost a lot of the, you know, different forms of environments, placed with more texture, placed with more, again, cross-identity contact. And it's really amazing to me to know that this like really critical piece of trans history, of trans organizing, emerged specifically out of trans digital space. So yeah, it's really just wanted to bring that in while we're talking about this stuff, because I think it's such a good example that like, yes, we can make these digital spaces. I am not a technologist, so I'm excited to talk with all of you now about how we make this real, because I'm just a silly little writer who has a million ideas and likes to make provocation. So let's go to that next portion. Wilfred, or I don't know who's leading us into the next thing, but
yeah, so we're gonna move on to the breakout session now. And so this is where we all get to chat in small groups. I don't think there's gonna be more than a couple people in each group, but yeah, are there any like quick nuggets of thoughts that you want all of us to take into the breakouts, Annie and Matthew, in 15, 20 seconds?
Again, I'm going to go back to the body. How do we carry our bodies more fully into digital spaces? If we're not figuring out how to do that, if we're not figuring out how to just get off of, again, I liked the touch versus the swipe that was mentioned earlier. How do we become more embodied online is my question of the day, I guess.
That was beautiful. I'll just leave it there too.